fact check on a tweet that I posted. Fact check by the Voice of America. I had a conversation with a friend from the journalism ecosystem in Nigeria. This is an old friend. Me and this person go many years back. And this person said, you know what, David? This reminds me of something which has been bugging me for a long time. And this person proceeded to describe to me how when they used to be on the radio in Nigeria, it would often happen that you would get proposals from VOA or from BBC Media Action or from some other Western media organization coming to the Nigerian radio station and saying, hey, we want to train your staff. We want to do this for you, we want to do that for you. They take the staff on retreats, put them up in a nice hotel, take them through seminars and training programs, and essentially creates a framework with which the station was to design its editorial policy and its editorial direction. At the ground level at the time, the staff, this person and his colleagues didn't necessarily see it as anything sinister or anything untoward. They rather saw it as, oh, it's a privilege, These guys have come from wherever they've come from London or from DC or whatever. They've put us up in a nice hotel. We're eating some nice food. We're enjoying some nice ambience, and supposedly they're, helping us improve our skills, helping us, get to another level in our careers. So it's a good thing, right? And he said, it occurred to me a few months ago that all they were doing during that period was that they were essentially taking over the radio station's editorial policy and directing the radio station, sometimes very subtly, sometimes not so subtly, telling the radio station effectively what to put on air, especially where certain things were concerned. In some instances, they would actually, as a form of payment or as a quid pro quo with the radio station, they would actually take like an hour of airtime to broadcast their own content on this radio station. And no one seemed to understand why there was any issue with that. And this person was saying that it was until fairly recently that it all clicked. That this is all an influence peddling operation. And this is foreign state-backed media essentially trying to dictate to Nigerian media establishments and to Nigerian journalists what their audiences should hear, especially concerning things where the foreign governments backing them had some kind of an interest. And it just occurred to him that this wasn't journalism training. This wasn't people just trying to help out. This was a sophisticated propaganda operation. And it only just clicked. And we're having that conversation because, as you may know, if you're watching this video, a few days ago, I posted a tweet where I analyzed several reasons why, in my opinion, the US military should not, under any circumstances, be allowed to open a military base in Nigeria. Apart from the fact that US military bases, historically, wherever they opened in Africa, have not served any security purpose to the locals there, have not made the locals in any safer. In fact, in the case of Niger, the US military base that opened there in 2012 only saw an escalation of what we now know as Boko Haram and ISWAP to the point where they became the deadliest terror groups in the world, and the US military base was staring at this happening. There's that, and then for me, the bigger point was that the US military bases exist first and foremost to protect American interests in that region, which, according to the US's own stated foreign policy documents, is the protection of the flow of African resources to the global market. In other words, as far as the US military is concerned, what is important about Africa is the things that are under Africa's soil and not the 1.2 billion inconveniently located human beings who just happen to live above it. And To be honest, I don't think you need to have a degree in political science to understand this. I think it's your lived experience, especially if you've lived in the Sahel or the West African region. It's common sense. We've lived through this experience. And the VOA decided to do a fact check on the streets. And the fact check was titled Nigerian Journalist Misleads Millions of People on X, that is Twitter. And then, the so-called fact check then proceeded to take one paragraph out of my 9 paragraph post, one paragraph where I referenced lithium in Kogi and uranium in Niger, and then proceeded to say, hey, we don't actually mine lithium in Kogi and we don't mine uranium in Niger. But hey, look, the Chinese do, the French do, and the Spanish do, and it was almost funny because in a way it was almost kind of like inadvertently proving my point that you are trying to make the point that you don't have your primary interest isn't in mineral resource exploitation, but here you are reeling off the statistics for who is primarily involved in that mineral resource exploitation and giving the breakdown of who has number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spots. And it almost sounds like the part that was unsaid was we want to get in on the action, But putting that aside, um, what sort of jumped out for me about all of this was 2 things. First of all, the person who was trotted out to do this fact check happened to be an African, a Kenyan journalist, a Kenyan investigative journalist who had to flee Kenya in 2021 after doing an expose about guns in the country. And I thought this was very instructive because, first of all, that's one of the usual tactics, which dates back arguably to even pre-colonial times. Whenever there is need for an adversarial interaction between the usual suspects and someone from or on the African continent, then what is preferred is that interaction shouldn't be a direct one, but there should be a sort of local sock puppet who is used to carry out that dirty job, right? And it's a recurring motif over and over and over again in history. You can draw a line back from this right back to the post World War II era during the so-called Cold War, when people were running riots all over Africa, overthrowing democratically elected governments, and all sorts of crazy things were happening. And someone like Patrice Lumumba, for example, when he was overthrown in a coup and he was murdered brutally, even though it's public knowledge now that it was the American CIA and the Belgians who orchestrated it and who had direct involvement in it, till today, what history remembers is that it was somebody called Mobutu Sese Seko, who was a local Congolese person, who was the person who actually was responsible for it and who was the major beneficiary, which technically is true. But it's just very interesting that that's how these things always work. So it's rare for the actual masquerade who is actually trying to target you to come out by themselves and face you. There's always going to be an African who's going to be put in the firing line to do the dirty job and to absorb whatever backlash may come. But even that is by the way. What really, for me, what struck me and what I want to talk about today is the fact that this thing that was done, this very sort of bad faith, supposed fact check that was done to try to discredit what was a very creditable point, that under no circumstances should a US military base be allowed to open up in Nigeria, which, I don't think you're going to find anybody arguing in the US that a Nigerian military base should be allowed to open up in the US. So if a Nigerian journalist says that a US military base shouldn't be allowed to open up in Nigeria, I'm not sure how that is a controversial statement to make, but that's the clown world that we live in now, apparently, where, only certain people are allowed to say certain things where it concerns them, and other people apparently, some animals are more equal than others. But anyway, I thought I'd make the point that even though several people in the whole Twitter firestorm that followed it and everything, people were making statements like, well, the VOA is it's a CIA mouthpiece. It's run out of Langley, yada yada yada. Tucker Carlson's dad ran it. That may or may not be true, but for me, knowing the little that I know about how the internal workings of the US government are, it's highly unlikely that this was some sort of skull and dagger operation in some secret bunker somewhere. No, that's not how it works. It's basically just a regular office where someone whose job it is to assess what is considered to be a threat to an American government interest flags something up, and then it's somebody's job to respond to that threat. And the response was this fact check that came out. It's not something that came out of some James Bond type of plot. It's something that was literally probably recorded in in an entry on Microsoft Planner or Asana or Trello or something. It's just a work task for someone. The fact that the task happens to be trying to assassinate the credibility of a Nigerian journalist is completely unimportant. It's just, by the way, it's just a job for someone. And why that is important is because I thought to myself that if the VOA exists to project and promote American interests in that way, because whether you like it or not, the VOA is a US government mouthpiece. That's all it is and will ever be. Where is the equivalent for a country like Nigeria? And what I mean by equivalent is what the VOA has done here from an American point of view is nothing extraordinary. It's nothing terrible. All they've done is they've identified something that they assess to be a threat to their American interests. If their American interest is that they want to open a base on a country on another continent, 8,500 miles across the world, and doing so might contribute to starting a war which is going to exterminate 100 or 200 million people there, but it's going to be in their interest somehow. Well, that 100 or 200 million people there is collateral damage. That's the American way. War is as American as apple pie, as they say. And the associated criminality that goes on with war and the profiteering and the death that goes on with war is just the way it works, right? So if they have that architecture with which to promote their interests, where is the equivalent architecture on our side of the Atlantic? That's what I'm actually worried about. Because here's the thing. It's public knowledge now that the so-called election that held in Nigeria last year, the person who was declared the winner of that election, no matter how disputed the election was, the person that was declared the winner, I think the world has a very clear idea of who that person is. I've done a lot of work surrounding the very identity of this person. It's not a secret, both in the US and in Nigeria, that the current Nigerian president is a drug dealer. And the current Nigerian president has a sealed indictment for heroin trafficking in America. It's not a secret, right? I've gone through a lot of trouble alongside Aaron Greenspan of Plainsight.org, going through more than a year now of FOIA litigation to establish this, right? And we've had thousands of pages of material released to us, all of which is in the public domain now. Even though this information doesn't really seem to have made much of a dent on any of the material realities around us. So knowing that is the case, I think it's not a controversial comment to make that the current Nigerian president is a US intelligence asset. It's a puppet, right? So the Nigerian state has been captured. The Nigerian presidency and the current Nigerian government does not represent us. It doesn't represent Nigerians. So when I ask that where is the equivalent infrastructure for projecting Nigeria's interests, the information infrastructure, you can't tell me something like NTA or Radio Nigeria, or Voice of Nigeria, because those things are government institutions which have been captured by this, US intelligence behemoth, right? So they are not speaking for us. They are being animated by an external entity. And that's fine. But here's the thing. Where does it happen anywhere on the world, anywhere on the planet, that 200 million people, allegedly 200 million people, exist in a country and have no capacity whatsoever to communicate what is in their interests or what they consider to be their group or national interest? Where does it happen? Even if the government has been captured, there always has to be something, some sort of citizen led alternative that is set up. That's how it happens. Almost in pretty much every example that I can think of where a government has been captured, there is always some sort of oppositional framework that arises. And at the spearhead of it, there's always an information resource, a journalistic ecosystem that is developed to rival that which has been captured from the state. In Nigeria, we don't really have that. In Nigeria, what we have is the state information architecture, which, as we've established, has been captured by the elements in power who themselves do not represent Nigerians because they didn't win an election, and they have been put in place by foreign intelligence agencies. They don't report to us. They don't answer to us. They answer to Langley. They answer to DC and Virginia and Maryland and Paris and London. They don't answer to us. They answer to everybody except us, right? So we have that. Then we have the sort of cheap, low quality media establishments chasing like Google AdSense revenue and what little commercial advertising revenue is to be made in Nigeria, which isn't a lot. And then for the most part, what we then have, which parades itself as the citizen-led independent journalism ecosystem, is basically NGO-funded storytelling establishments. And now, here's my major problem here. These NGO-funded establishments, whether they realize it or not, whether they accept it or not, are basically putting out content that is in line with the interests of the people who are funding them. And who are these people who are funding them? So in the case of the online media, the biggest online news media platform in Nigeria, you would probably say, is Premium Times. Where does that funding come from? It's Omidyar Network, primarily, which has been linked to CIA activity in the past. I don't know for certain whether it's a CIA front, as many of these NGOs are. I can't say for certain, but it has at least collaborated with the CIA before, which tells a story on its own. And that's who is funding arguably Nigeria's biggest online news establishment. The so-called journalism training institutions in Nigeria, such as, for example, the ICIR. Who funds the ICIR? It's the MacArthur Foundation. Again, these are Americans, linked to the American establishment and the intelligence establishment in America. Every time you take a look at any major journalism establishment, which is funded by grant money, and you follow the money, where does it lead you? It leads you all the way back to Washington, D.C. in some way, shape, or form. In other words, none of these actors are actually independent at all. And that's a problem because while the Americans, the French, the British, everyone else on earth, in fact, has their own journalism mouthpieces that they fund to project their own societal and geopolitical aims and goals and whatever, we basically don't have ours. What we have is essentially sock puppets parroting the narratives that are of benefit to the places where the money is coming from. So they're using our voices to speak, but they're not speaking our interests, they're speaking their interests, right? Which is how come you have a Kenyan journalist using her Kenyan voice and a Kenyan platform and the skills that she developed on the continent of Africa to attack a fellow African journalist who is trying to be part of a solution for West Africa. That's how things like that happen. Another way this is a huge problem for me. I'm just even putting aside the fact that you essentially then have some parts of the world that are allowed to have geopolitical goals and aims and project them, and some other parts of the world that apparently aren't, and who are just supposed to parrot other people's geopolitical goals and aims and somehow fit themselves into those paradigms. Apart from that, there's also the issue of what roles that these so-called independent journalists or even journalists in general in Nigeria are being trained to fill. Now, if you remember how I mentioned at the outset that this friend of mine whom I spoke to mentioned that it was a regular thing for these foreign bodies to come and take them for some training or the other, and basically almost make it as a default position that they somehow get to determine what journalism is or should be, and that we somehow by default don't understand what journalism is. So it's BBC Media Action, or it's Voice of America, or it's MacArthur Foundation, or whoever it is, some foreign player whose job it is to teach us, how to journalist, basically, right? Here's why that's a problem. Now, in the countries that these people come from, the role that journalists play is very, very different to the role that journalists are apparently told that they are supposed to play in Africa, in Nigeria. So the role that a journalist plays in America, a journalist is not merely a news reporter, right? A journalist is many things. A journalist is someone who engages with the public, someone who does citizen engagement. A journalist is a public educator. A journalist is a very integral part of the democratic experience, if you like, the experience of actually operating a functioning democracy. The journalist, the person, is a very, very big part of that ecosystem. It's a big part of the process of democracy. In Nigeria, a journalist is taught that your job is to shrink yourself, make yourself small and invisible, and basically just push out products, push out content, right? You are not meant to be notable in any way. You're not meant to have positions and opinions and anything. You're meant to be small and invisible and bland, basically. So the minute that a journalist arises in Nigeria who does not fit into that paradigm, the journalist is maybe a bit opinionated, the journalist maybe has a bit of personality, the journalist is willing to robustly engage as part of the citizen engagement process, the Nigerian journalism establishment does not understand where this is coming from. And that person even then gets labeled as a sensationalist or a charlatan or an attention seeker, all sorts of things. Because as far as the Nigerian journalism establishment is taught, according to the training that they have received from BBC and VOA and MacArthur and whoever else, what a journalist in our context is supposed to be is this meek person who kind of does a simulacrum of holding power accountable, but doesn't actually hold it accountable. The robust process of holding power accountable. Now, that is taught to their own journalists where they come from, right? That is taught to their journalists, but that's not what they bring to Africa when they come here. What they bring to us is basically a souped up public relations, and they teach that to us as journalism. And then we wonder why most Nigerian journalists are not actually doing what many of us would consider to be world-changing work. Most Nigerian journalists are basically just establishment people who don't rock the boat. That's what they're taught. And where does this teaching come from? It comes from where the funding comes from. And that's an issue. So when you see your, BBCs and VOAs and whoever funding journalism in Nigeria or funding journalism training in Nigeria, what is the purpose of doing it? To what end? Are they funding journalism that would change Nigeria, or are they funding the training of journalists who will become catalysts for change? Or are they funding journalism and journalists that will maintain the status quo. Because if you think about it logically, if, as the world currently exists, we in the so-called global south, are not having the best of it, and the global north, which has a parasitic relationship with the global south, is actually, on top at the moment, why would the funding from the global north want to change that basic situation of things? Why would they? No, actually, what they want is to maintain the status quo. And that's exactly what the funding exists to do. So you will see most of the time when, for example, stories are being funded for production in Nigeria, what stories are being funded? If it's stories about, say, corruption or whatnot, you will find that it's stories that go maybe 1 or 2 inches beneath the surface. Very sort of polite, surface level stories that don't really ruffle any feathers. So stories like, oh, this thing was in the budget and the politician in charge did not actually deliver. This contract was awarded to one shady company that was incorporated 2 days ago. Like corruption scandals of the kind that, well, it causes a bit of a sensation for 5 minutes and everybody forgets about it because, frankly speaking, who cares? But the kind of stuff that could potentially, for example, bring down a government, that's not what these guys will ever fund. Something that can create some kind of change, some kind of significant, long-lasting or systemic change, they're not interested in that. They're interested in surface level stuff. They're interested in things like, for example, if you can produce any kind of story that has the phrase climate change in it, you will get all the funding you're looking for. All the funding you're looking for. Right? So if, for example, say, and this is a real life example. So in 2022, when the Lagdo Dam in Cameroon, the Lagdo Reservoir in Cameroon got filled up to, I think, 99.6%, and the Cameroonians had to open the Lagdo Dam. And the excess runoff from there led to severe flooding along the Benue River Basin in Nigeria. I cannot tell you how many Nigerian journalists got funded to produce stories talking about how this was something climate change, something climate equity, yada, 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 yada. Meanwhile, as I established on this very YouTube channel, what was the actual problem? It was an infrastructural problem, right? When the Lagdo Dam was constructed, it was projected at the time that whenever the dam were to be filled, which happens roughly at 10-year intervals, that the runoff from the opening of the dam would cause flooding in Nigeria. So the agreement at the time it was built was that an equivalent dam on the Nigerian side called the Dasin Hausa Dam would be built to trap that runoff. And the Dasin Hausa Dam was supposed to, among other things, produce electricity via hydroelectric power generation to add to Nigeria's grid. And it was supposed to irrigate farmland across 4 Nigerian states as well. Now, the Dasin Hausa Dam was never built, which is how come roughly every 10 years, whenever there is that flooding, if you like, of the Lagdo Reservoir, and then the dam is opened, and then there's flooding in the Benue River, that happens roughly every 10 years. It happened in 2012, happened in 2022. So this was an infrastructural story. This was not a story about climate change. But was the Pulitzer Center interested in funding a story about infrastructural deficits in Nigeria and how so and so amount of money needs to be spent to build a dam, and how that dam would irrigate so and so thousand hectares of land in Nigeria, which could improve Nigeria's food security, which could improve Nigeria's power situation, which could add so and so percentage points to Nigeria's GDP growth per year? Was the Pulitzer Center interested in that? Was MacArthur interested in that? Was Siwa interested in that? Were any of these guys interested? No, what they're interested in is climate change. So whoever wrote a false story, falsely attributing what happened in 2022 to climate change, got the funding, and that happened. And that will keep on happening because we are not funding our own journalism to tell stories from our perspective for our own benefit. Instead, we are being funded to use our voices to tell other people's stories from their perspective for their benefit, but using blackface. That's essentially what is happening. And this was exactly the thinking I had in my head when I set out to set up West Africa Weekly 3 years ago. And, in its first iteration as a Substack newsletter, which it was at the time, I thought to myself that this would be the perfect vehicle to give Nigerians the opportunity to create their own independent platform, telling these stories from their perspective for their own benefit. And what I mean by create is basically fund such a platform, because the funding is the issue. I should specify that there's a difference between funding journalism and funding media. They're not the same thing. Media is profitable. Journalism is not, right? Journalism is a social good. It's not profitable. It's never profitable, right? So I don't care if it's the LA Times, the New York Times, the Concord newspaper in Nigeria, whatever it is, any significant journalistic medium of note is not profitable, which is why more often than not, there's some money bag, some billionaire or a government institution or a non-profit behind it. That's why journalism is not profitable. Media is a different thing altogether, because there you can do all your clickbait and all that. That's media, that's not journalism, right? They are two related but different things, right? Media can be profitable. Some people have found ways of blending media and journalism. But in this context, journalism has to be a separate thing. Journalism is not profitable. Now, when I set up West Africa Weekly, I thought that in so doing, I was giving Nigeria the opportunity to fund the first of its kind, of such a platform, because every other supposed independent platform that existed at that time was NGO-funded. It's the same grant money. So it's always coming from abroad. And for the fact that it comes from abroad, principally the US, there are always certain places you cannot go. For example, there was a reason why I was the only journalist in Nigeria who was able to go after the story of Tinubu's drug dealing history the way I did. There is a reason why I was the only journalist in Nigeria who was able to go after the story of Tinubu's certificate forging history as I did. That was the only reason. There was a reason why I was the only journalist in Nigeria who was able to go after the story of Tinubu's history as basically an intelligence asset in America, like I did. No other journalist in Nigeria could do that. And the reason was simple. My colleagues, many of whom I speak to, who are very aware of these things and who would have liked to cover these things, have people that they answer to who would not have been comfortable. They went after these things for obvious reasons. Follow the money. In my case, it was whatever little audience I had and whatever little subscription revenue I had that kept me going. And I followed this thing as far as I could until eventually I got burnt out. And I said to myself, you know what? I'm going to take a sabbatical from investigative journalism. I need to recharge. I want to do some other things for a while. I've never set out to be a hero. There are 200 million people in Nigeria, so it can't be up to one person to carry 200 million people on his back, right? And I basically stepped away. The last thing I did before I stepped away was that I wrote this book, which was like my magnum opus, like my tell-all. And I stepped away, right? And I think it's important to let people know now some key details about how that experiment panned out. So at its peak, before I stopped writing West Africa Weekly as a monthly newsletter, at its peak, I think I had about 55,000 subscribers. Of those 55,000 total subscribers, the total number of people who ever subscribed, paid subscriptions from Genesis, the total number, and that does not mean people who had subscriptions on an ongoing basis or total number of ongoing subscriptions. It means including people whose subscriptions had lapsed, who weren't subscribed anymore. The total from beginning to when I left never hit 500. I think at its peak was about 400 and something. And that's the total. So from 2021, when I started, thankfully there was a $30,000 grant from Substack, which tided me over for the first year. But from 2021, when I started, to 2023, when I basically took a bow and I basically let the Substack site, go into a sunset process because West Africa Weekly morphed into an independent website. There's a new management team that came in, they invested, and I'm no longer directly in charge, and I'm no longer the sole beneficial owner of West Africa Weekly, right? Across that 2.5 year period, it was a struggle from beginning to end, right? And the reason I'm saying this is not because I'm saying, people should should have sympathy for me, or I'm looking for I'm looking for anyone's pity or anything. Because when I set out, I was aware of what this landscape looked like, and I suspected that something like that would happen, right? Nobody forced me to do this. What I am saying is just for the benefits of any Nigerians coming after me who seem to understand what is really going on in the world, and who seem to understand how dangerous a place the world is becoming now, and how important it is to be able to project your own narrative in a world where everybody is trying to force their narratives onto you. That whether it's David Hundeyin or it's not David Hundeyin, whoever it is, Nigerians need, as a matter of urgency, to find a way to fund their own journalism, and do so in a way that removes the need for that external validation from your VOA or your BBC or whoever, because those guys should not get to determine what is or is not good journalism for you. Because the existential context those guys come from and the governments that fund them have different priorities to you, have different goals to you, have different aspirations and perspectives to you, right? So again, whether Nigerians choose to fund independent journalism or they don't, at this point, I think we're well beyond asking anybody to do what they should or should not do. I personally have stepped away, as many of you may know. I have a comfortable 9 to 5 job in tech now. I'm recording this video after work, so whether or not people choose to do what it is that they need to do, I mean, it's no longer a personal issue for me to be worried about. But I am saying this from the point of view of someone who is worried about the future of our part of the world. As many of you may be aware, the world is going to war. I don't know when it's going to happen. Nobody knows exactly when it's going to happen, but the world is going to war, right? It's unmistakable. All the signs are there. This is the early 20th century repeating itself. The world is definitely going to war at some point. Many of the billionaires have started, many of you have heard, have been building bunkers in New Zealand. The world is going to war at some point in the not too distant future. And in that coming war, it's going to be a war which is information first and digital first. That's the world that we're going into. So if you're going into that world and you don't have any means of projecting your own viewpoints, your own perspectives, your own existence onto the world, and you're waiting for one foreign CSO or one BBC or one Bloomberg or one Reuters or one CNN or one Voice of America to speak for you, I'm sorry. That's not going to end well for all of us, myself included, right? So that's why I thought I would do this video, because what is happening now, this fact check that was done, I'm not sure that even the thousands of people who are responding to it even understand the significance of what it means. Because I put out a tweet saying, under no circumstances should the US military be allowed to open a military base in Nigeria. And the Voice of America then puts out a fact check saying that tweet was misleading to my followers and essentially calling me a liar. If you understand the significance of that, that's essentially the US almost declaring war on you and saying, no, we want to have a military presence on your soil, whether you want it or not. Because whether Nigerian people think that having the military of a foreign power on their soil is something that should happen or not, we want it to happen. That's a very colonial way of thinking. That's the world we're going into. So, Nigerians, the world is it's not going to be a very nice place over the coming few years for us. Even those of us who are outside the country, we know that all too well. So, whatever it is that needs to be done, hey, I'm not making any recommendations at this point because, as I said, I think we're well past that. But I think we all know the things that need to be done. So if we like, we should do them, and if we don't, well, we're all going to reap the shege together. Good evening.